Hi everyone, and welcome to week 2 of the course. A number of you have written to me if there were any problems, so please everyone, if there are any questions or issues, please just write to me and I will get back to you as soon as possible. We do have an assignment coming up, and if you have any questions about that, you can reach out to me. So this week we're moving into looking at, I'm starting out with the topic of Western biomedicine as culture. And as with the idea of what is health and your body as a metaphor, I realize this can be a bit disorienting. I think for a lot of Canadians, we tend to think of Western biomedicine as the only approach to healthcare, whether we think that consciously or not, that is how we approach it. So I'm trying to get you to think outside of that. So I realize that's a process. But I think it's helpful to think of Western biomedicine as culture, as one of many cultures, rather than as the only way or the scientifically proven way of approaching health. And so I'm going to move into looking at our mainstream approach to healthcare in this way. Just at the outset here, I did want to make clear that I'm in no way dismissing Western biomedicine. I was just in the hospital with a family member this week and am grateful that this is accessible to all Canadians through universal healthcare and that these cutting edge technologies are available. So that is not what I'm doing here, but what I am doing is trying to get us to open up our aperture and look at things more broadly. And so one of the ways of doing this, I've been trying to get you to think about what you think health means, how you understand your own body and the meaning of your own body. So at this point, I want us to look at healthcare as a culture. And so I had been coming to this conclusion on my own over many years, and I have been somebody who's partaken of healthcare from many, many different systems. And so it crystallized when I came across the work of Coward and Ratanakul and their edited collection, A Cross-Cultural Dialogue on Healthcare Ethics. And so Coward, I think he's retired now, but he was a religious studies scholar, and Ratanakul is from Thailand. And so already they were bringing together these two systems, Ratanakul coming out of a Buddhist system of healthcare and healthcare ethics, Coward coming out of the Canadian system, but also religiously inflected. And so they write in the introduction to their book, our research led us to a surprising conclusion, namely that modern Western biomedicine and its healthcare system is itself a culture with its own belief system, social structure, initiation rituals, language, dress, and educational system. So that is a mouthful, and I was really taken aback when I read this because this puts it in a nutshell what I think I was moving towards. And so what they're saying here is that when any of us walk into many healthcare settings, and I'm going to look at hospitals because it's the most obvious one, we often feel we're moving into a foreign territory. It's very different than other spaces that we're used to. And so I want to look at why that might be and move through some of these issues that they're talking about, that it's itself a culture with social structure, rituals, language, etc. And so it's very interesting to see, and I've read a number of narratives by medical doctors who became patients, and the experience was the exact same for them, if not more so than for somebody who wasn't a medical professional, partly because they were used to being in a position of power in that setting, and suddenly they're a patient, and so they really had a sense of what that felt like for the people coming into it with an illness and in a very vulnerable state. So I want to start moving us through some of these concepts that they're bringing forward, and then we're going to reflect on it at the end regarding what you think about these ideas. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. I think that's probably the best thing. So when we go into the hospital, hopefully it's not in a state of emergency because that makes things 1,000 times more stressful, but we come to the reception. So this is, in my experience, this looks very typical for a Canadian hospital. I suspect for an American hospital too. And so it's interesting to look at this, and I think this is where anthropology is very helpful, where you look at your own culture like you're coming from a different place that doesn't know anything about it. So I would ask you to think about what this is saying, the way this is set up. Now, clearly, it's very sterile. It's very institutional looking, and that glass in front of it is it's not like a restaurant. It's not a open, welcoming space. And so typically there are people behind that glass who are kind of the gatekeepers, really. And so you have to give your information to that person, and so on. And so, well, actually, usually you have to wait in the chairs with all the other people usually before. So the power structure is pretty clear right from the beginning, and you're the one waiting, right, for these people to decide to let you in to this. In some ways, you could say like a kind of a sacred space. So I'm bringing up an image here. I would wager that anyone, certainly in North America, probably in the Western world, would know immediately the occupation of this person in the photograph. And I touched on this in the shamanism section, the idea of regalia or uniforms of office kind of thing. And I think we think this is a thing of the past. It's not. I could put up a picture of a police officer, a dentist, a lawyer, an accountant, even a professor, and I think it's very easy to pick out what their occupation is. So regardless of whether we think we do, we generally have certain ways of dressing for certain occupations, often related to just practicalities, but not just that. And so if we look at this, I've picked a very typical example. It's a man, and I've done that on purpose because I think that medical doctors still tend to be gendered male in the public imagination, despite the fact that so many doctors are now female. Of course, that's changing, but if we look at television shows, it's very common for it to be this heroic male doctor. If we look at programs like House, and that has a very long history, and I'll be talking about that when we look at Hippocrates and Galen, going back to ancient Greece. And so let's look at this figure, and I'm going to ask you to look at it and analyze it. So first of all, he's wearing the white jacket. And this is a symbol of office, right? You could almost say quasi-priestly office. And so it's white, the color of purity in Western culture coming out of Christianity. And we know there's a phenomenon called white jacket effect or white jacket syndrome, how people react when they see the white jacket. For some people, they go into a panic the minute they're in a healthcare setting. For other people, the jacket is very reassuring. It's a symbol of authority, but also of their training, that they've gone through a training of some kind that allows them to hold this kind of authority. He's also, he's got a kind of business wear underneath, which also signals competency, authority in Western culture, very with the tie and the dress pants. Then we see the stethoscope, which is deeply satisfying, and many professions have these kind of objects that are almost fetishized. So, for instance, in with lawyers, it might be their briefcase. They have a specific type of briefcase they carry their papers in, and so on. So the stethoscope is definitely a meaningful symbol of being a medical practitioner. It could be also a nurse. And he's holding what I assume is meant to be the person's files. And so up until very recently, only the medical professionals would have access to this information. So it was a kind of esoteric information. That is changing because information is now available online, and increasingly people have access to their medical records. And so it's interesting to look at what that means in terms of power within the relationship. We also see he's smiling, so he looks very competent, he looks very friendly, and so he's kind of the image of the perfect doctor here. So this slide, as far as I can read it anyway, is a slide depicting nurses and doctors. And so interestingly, obviously they're dressed differently, the whole idea of the scrubs. When I watched Nurse Jackie, I was very interested to see the way the nurses are talking about the scrubs and how they express the person and so on. But a uniform is meant to, in many ways, downplay the individual. And so in this case, which is more typical in my experience, is that they're one color, often blue or green. And so often they're the nurses, not always, but so uniforms are meant to help you know who's who in the hospital setting. That's partly their function. And so we see this depiction, all of them are wearing stethoscopes, but there's definitely a power hierarchy. And this is where I do hope the people who work in hospitals will weigh in and help me out, because I have a sense of some of it, obviously, that the medical doctor has more authority than the nurses, for instance. And this, again, varies from country to country. I met a nurse of Scottish extraction, and she said that in Scotland, the doctor-nurse relationship is much more equal than it is in Canada. So this will vary, perhaps even from province to province. I'm not sure. But they're all looking at, this is staged, obviously, but they're all looking at the file of the person or the. So again, this idea that Ratanacool and Coward are talking about of the arcane language. So part of the issue is that we may have access to our records, but we can't necessarily read them because they're in a very specific format, often using language that we don't understand. And so this also contributes to that idea that you're moving into a foreign country. Everybody's dressed differently. Everybody's speaking in a way that we're not necessarily understanding what they mean. And we've all had that experience where they'll say code so-and-so over the loudspeaker. So it's a language we're not privy to it. Only these medical professionals have this kind of, if I'm going to use religious language, the sacred knowledge. I want to look at the hospital setting from the point of view of the patient, and this is where we can see the power differential really coming into play, and is probably one of the key reasons why, even if you're a medical professional yourself, if you go in as a patient, you feel the same way as everybody else. Because first of all, part of going into the hospital is you're quote unquote institutionalized. So your clothes are taken away from you, your things are taken away from you. You're often asked to dress in one of these gowns, which, you know, is not pleasant for anybody. It's often open at the back, and your legs are bare. So you're in a it feels very vulnerable to be dressed like this in public. This is basically like pajamas, or even less than pajamas, and suddenly you're in public. So the patient, you can see even from the body language here, he's in bed. He's having to listen patiently to this healthcare professional who's sort of interpreting for him. And so the way this model is set up, obviously it's in flux again and is changing, but up until very recently, certainly for a lot of the 20th century, it was very much the idea of the patient having almost no power in the situation, and particularly the medical doctor having the power. This is shifting. There's been all these movements for patient rights and so on, but certainly the way it's set up, it's putting the patient often feels kind of disoriented and vulnerable. And so again, this is changing, and I've seen it in my own lifetime that increasingly family is welcome to stay in the room, and the rooms are set up more like a bedroom, and so you can bring in personal items and so on. When I was younger, that was sort of frowned upon. But certainly I do think this is changing, but nonetheless, a lot of these kind of aspects of institutionalization do remain in this model. So I want to end with doing some reflections on the material that's been presented. So I'm going to ask you just to think about, what is the feeling when you enter into a Canadian hospital? What's your overall feeling and sense of the space? And we will be talking about things like healing space in this course, and how other traditions think about it. So in terms of the culture of biomedicine, what does a healing space look like? What is it expressing? So why do you feel that way? What about the setting and the architecture causes you to feel that way? None of this is accidental. When you walk into a church or a synagogue, you feel a certain way. It's set up in a very specific way to make you feel either welcome or unwelcome, so on. So, so why do you feel this way when you walk into the hospital setting? Number 3, what is the hierarchy within the hospital? So I'm going to ask everyone to weigh in here. We can work on it. When I'm in class in person, we put it on the board, and, you know, radiologists, janitors, we make a list of all the people. So I will do that in the discussion boards, where hopefully people who work in hospitals can weigh in and help us. Who has the most power and authority? So this is interesting, because what is invisible to us is that there are things like hospital boards and CEOs and so on. So in actual fact, they have a tremendous amount of authority, but we don't, certainly for the average person in the hospital system, you don't have the sense. So, so who has the power and authority in that structure? Who has the least? And why? Why do you think it's set up in this way? So I'm going to ask you to reflect on that, and hopefully we'll be able to have a good discussion on the discussion boards.